Chelsea had been a child when the humans had been discovered and immediately dismissed by the Solution Empire. She doubted most could remember the day it happened. It had been a minor footnote in the day's newscast. A scout drone had tracked signs of FTL activation to a small border colony. Observed quietly, safely, and from a great distance, the robotic servant found a grid of blocky, ugly structures in gray and white, with the inhabitants stomping around in bulky spacesuits. There was a brief joke or two at the humans' expense for having to rely on airlocks and sealed suits instead of atmospheric containment fields. Then, the newscast moved on. In the halls of the Imperial Palace, a motion to formally contact this species was immediately shot down. The colony was ugly, primitive, and an eyesore. They were lucky the Emperor saw fit to leave them alone, located on a remote border of Zolution space as they were. No one could have foreseen that this simple act of apathy would save their entire species. 200 years would pass until the paths of the Zolution Empire and the United Earth Territories crossed again. By that time, Chelsea had grown from a child into a fine example of Zolution womanhood. Her horn-like saitena swept back from the ebony locks that framed her face. She had styled it in the fashion that was currently in vogue with the imperial court, so that one of her upper pair of eyes was concealed by her hair, leaving only 3 of the all-black spheres exposed. She had carefully chosen a gown of gold and shimmer silk and 6 pieces of gem-encrusted platinum to wear to the reception that night. Ambassadors from the United Earth Territories had finally been granted formal recognition by the Emperor, and he thought it would be amusing to hold a party in their honor, to dazzle them with the Empire's wealth and see what the reaction of such savages would be. All members of the diplomat houses were expected to play their part and act as they normally would. So Chelsea had dressed herself up as best she was able. Her time there tonight would not be normal, however. She had been given a mission. A minor mission, to be sure, and one suited for the status of a junior diplomat, but a mission nonetheless. A chance to be of service to the Emperor and the circle of exalted nobles that advised him and helped him guide the Empire. Her mission was to dance with one of the human ambassadors. She was to display the grace of the court's ladies and how dexterous their movements could be. The human would inevitably stumble or fall and provide the Emperor some amusement in his attempts at mimicking superior Zolution culture. It was not the sort of mission she would have wanted, but it was hers. Now she waited alongside a score of other dignitaries in the towering gold and black halls of the imperial court. Embroidered banners that told of the Empire's proud history hung from the pillars that lined the hall. Diamond plant vines crept and twisted along the walls, their crystalline fruit catching the light and making it dance for the alien nobles. Statues and paintings from the most skilled Zolution artists were placed here and there, while windows the size of bulk shuttles gave the partygoers a stunning view of the shimmering gold lights of the imperial city's nightscape. Everywhere Chelsea looked, there was beauty. The only place said to be more decadent would be the orbital palaces of the exalted nobles, but she would never see those in her lifetime. There was a gasp from the crowd. Chelsea looked up from her reverie to catch a brief glimpse of a rectangular craft, gray and bulky, flitting past one of the huge windows. It could only be the human ship. She caught her breath and tried to remember what they had told her of the creatures. She would be expected to dance with one. They were bipedal, she knew that much. The pictures she had seen were all of them in their ugly atmospheric suits, though. Would they need them here? She could very well imagine the human delegation coming through the platinum-glided gate, all bundled up in those clumsy gray and black things. Asking the delegation to dance while encumbered would be exactly the sort of thing the Emperor would do. Chelsea almost wished she had asked for more information, but immediately dismissed the thought. Asking to know more about them would be seen as untoward interest. The Emperor had decreed them savage, primitive things, and that was all his subjects needed to know. The humans were probably like their shuttle, squat, blocky, and ugly. So Chelsea was quite surprised when the gate opened and admitted the usual Zolution honor guard of 4 bodyguard drones, along with 3 aliens that did not look too dissimilar from Zolutions. Certainly their eyes were strange, multicolored things, and they had only two of them, and they lacked the cytena that allowed her kind to communicate without words. But other than that, they were quite alike. Chelsea wondered for a moment if they might not be some unfortunate splinter race that broke off from the Zolution forebears millennia ago. The lead one might not look too bad if only his skin were paler. She shook her head and rid herself of creeping thoughts. She had her mission. The Emperor must have his entertainment. She slowly slid through the crowd, pretending to make small talk with a fellow junior diplomat while she listened and waited for an opening.
You mean to say you pilot your ships yourselves? Like paupers?
One of the senior diplomats said. Chelsea couldn't remember his name, but could remember his face, a distant cousin of the Emperor thrice removed. It was clear he never got the position of senior diplomat through skill. The human ambassador smiled thinly, his two eyes clearly locked onto the diplomats. The United Earth Territories make limited use of drone ships, but yes, most of our vessels maintain a full crew, he said. We believe there are some things you shouldn't leave to machines.
Ah, a shame. So you must toil away at console and command chair to get your ships to move,
the senior diplomat said, taking a sip from his drink.
Meanwhile, I can manage a whole fleet just by giving a few orders and then sit back and enjoy a snifter of fine distilled fire ice while they dismantle whatever fool bandits or pirates are intruding on my domain that day.
I'm confused. What was your name again? One of the dignitaries said. Chelsea did know him. Enrit Hulk, a Star Master of the Zolution Defense Force, insufferable even to his colleagues. Chelsea had no idea how the human put up with him. Nelson, the human said. J. Nelson if you want to get specific. Ambassador Nelson, Enrit said. Did your species never invent computing machines? Perhaps you employ bloated, bioengineered brain calculators like those reprehensible Krev? No, Star Master, Ambassador Nelson said. We make full use of advanced computers to aid our human pilots. We just never quite got the knack of artificial intelligence the same way your people did. Ah, yes, advanced, Enrit said with a sniff. The Zolutions around him suddenly suppressed laughter, and Chelsea caught just enough of a tingle in her cytena to know that a joke had been quietly passed around. The human's smile never moved, but Chelsea got the sense he was aware of the mockery and choosing to ignore it. Chelsea suddenly wondered if the Emperor would get his entertainment after all.
Well, I find the whole thing quite savage,
one of the lesser nobles said.
Fighting is for machines to do. It's barbaric, bloody work that gentle beings do not indulge in.
Savage, perhaps, the ambassador said. Necessary also. Did you always have drones to fight for you? A brief silence fell on the group. Chelsea felt her cytena twitch as a message blossomed in her mind.
The Emperor begins to grow bored. Talk to the human. Be ready. The dance starts soon.
The message came. Chelsea recognized the mind signature of an imperial emissary and hastened to step forward.
My good Ambassador Nelson,
she began, bowing a little. The humans did that to greet each other, right? Or was it a hand gesture? She couldn't remember. It didn't matter. Once the night was done, she'd never see them again.
My name is Chelsea Exaby, junior diplomat of the 5th House. May I ask a question or two?
Plenty more than 2 questions about this lot. How do you stand living? Enrit asked, shaking his head. You don't have any defense drones, so you need to manually crew your ships. You don't have fully automated factories, agri-plants, or even general-purpose labor bots. Just to stay alive sounds like it requires so much. The Star Master made a face.
Work. I begin to pity the poor people of Earth,
the senior diplomat said, his belly shaking with each laugh that escaped his gullet.
So many things meant for robots being done by the good citizens of the territories. Can they truly not afford even a single full planetary automation?
How could they even keep one running? Enrit asked, smiling. They're still using fusion power. As the other dignitaries offered the human diplomat condolences on the state of his planet, his smile never wavered. His eyes, though, Chelsea caught something in them that she recognized despite how different they were. A brief flash of disappointment? Ambassador Nelson, Chelsea repeated, and started a bit as she found the human diplomat's full attention suddenly on her. That odd look in his eyes faded, but his gaze was no less intense. Yes, Miss Exeby, Nelson said, ignoring the twittering of the other solutions. What's your question? Chelsea thought fast. I wanted to ask. The resonance horn blew, shaking the entire hall for a brief moment before all fell into silence. The booming voice of the Emperor emissary followed, slightly softer than the Titanic horn. The bulk of the Zelusian nobility began to pair off as the emissary declared it was now time for the dance of Midnight Star. Would you care to dance? She finished lamely. Minutes later, the two were moving in circles together like overlapping waves, doing their best to mimic the rest of the court, who were also caught up in dancing, the dance of the Midnight Star. The ambassador had been silent since accepting her offer, his keen eyes tracking every movement the Zelusian nobles were making and reproducing them for the dance. His dancing wasn't perfect, but it was hardly the embarrassing spectacle the Emperor had wanted. Chelsea wondered if she would be ordered to force such a spectacle. She hoped not. Is it custom to keep silent during this dance? Nelson asked. Chelsea nearly missed a step. No. Why? She asked. Your fellows were a non-stop barrage of comments after I walked through the gate. You've only asked me once so far, and it was to dance, Nelson said. Aren't you curious about the alien savage come to your court? Chelsea grimaced, the human's tone playful but not exactly forgiving. It looked like you might need a break from the questions, she said. Though, of course, I'm curious. I have to apologize for my colleagues. Some of them have a little joy fizz, and it makes them act like 70-year-olds. 70 years, huh? For humans, that's a full life, Nelson commented as he moved around her. A full life? Only 70 years? Chelsea asked, her 4 eyes blinking. How could these poor humans have anything considered a full life in so short a time? I can't imagine what that's like. We Zelusians live for 1,000 years on average. The fruit of a wondrous marriage between our biological science and natural lifespan. I heard, Nelson said, bemused. It does explain a few things. You have the time necessary to do everything at a leisurely pace. Chelsea did not miss the little poke at how long it had taken for the ambassador to be recognized by the court. I prefer to say that our long time in the universe lets us do everything thoroughly, carefully, Chelsea said, swirling around Nelson before catching his hand again. Don't you find being pressed for time leaves you always in a hurry? Wouldn't you rather have time to think everything through? Perhaps. But there's a time for thought and a time for action, and perhaps our mortality hurrying us forward is a good thing, Ambassador Nelson said as he led her in the dance. Chelsea was duly impressed at how quickly he picked up the intricate moves, especially since there was no way he could have known about them beforehand. The dance had been specifically selected for its obscurity. The Emperor clapping with glee as he talked of how the primitives would be tripping over themselves trying to follow it. Her thought was interrupted as Nelson spoke again. Don't you find that having so much time makes it easier to put things off? To forget things that shouldn't be forgotten? There's a clarity that comes from being under the gun. Under the gun? Chelsea asked with a frown. Sorry, it's an old Earth saying, Nelson said. It means being under a strict time limit with dire consequences if you run out of time. At least that's what I understand it means. Earth language is context-heavy with our idioms. I see. We Zelusians have an expression that goes, the tide eating the shore. It means that anything can be done with enough time. Chelsea said, the opposite of yours. So one day us primitive humans might rival the great Zelusians. Tide eating the shore, Nelson said, grinning. Chelsea nodded approvingly. You really do catch on quick, but don't say that in front of the Emperor or his nobles, she said. The notion wouldn't sit well with them. I don't think our presence here is sitting well with them either, Nelson said, turning as Chelsea spun around him. It's been an interesting reception so far. It's enough to almost make me think the entire thing is some sort of prank for your leader's amusement. Chelsea did miss a step this time, but Nelson caught her hand and acted as a counterbalance. She recovered quick enough that no one else but Nelson noticed. He offered her a small smile as they fell back into the dance. Yeah, I thought as much. That's fine, he said. I can stand a night of mockery if it means the treaty I brought gets signed. Peace of mind for my people is worth more than my pride.
Such words. You'd never make it here in the imperial court,
Chelsea commented.
Pride is the only currency that exalted nobles trade in.
Then I'll be glad to be away from here, Nelson said, even if the current company is pleasant. The dancing lasted for a few minutes more, and Chelsea used the time to ask Nelson about his people, while Nelson asked about hers. Chelsea was quietly impressed by his humble and frank manner, so unlike that of the eternally boasting nobles she was used to. The music grew quieter, and the dancers slowed as the dance drew to an end.
Well, Ambassador Nelson,
Chelsea said as the pair bowed to each other.
Despite how brief this time was, I assure you it will not be forgotten.
The same, Ambassador Nelson said, giving her that smile again. I think I've perhaps learned more from this dance than the entire evening with your court. Unfortunate that I see one of them beckoning me even now. Maybe I can expect some manners now that their initial test of my patience is done. Good evening, Miss Chelsea. With that, the ambassador gave her another little bow and headed off to one of the senior diplomats who was signaling quite strenuously for his attention. Chelsea sighed. She knew what would be coming next. She didn't even need to turn around to know that the emperor was glowering at her from atop his massive throne. She had been given one solemn duty as a junior diplomat, to dance with the savage ambassador and make him look foolish so the emperor's day could be lightened by a laugh. Instead, he danced perfectly. It was she who had stumbled. Worse, she had a thoughtful little conversation with the man, had even been a little impressed. She had not shown even a modicum of proper disdain for a primitive. The emperor's amusement had been denied him. There would be a great penalty. Later that evening, long after a very bored emperor signed a treaty dealing with borders and sovereignty, Chelsea would be summoned before the emperor in the imperial court. There, she would be expelled from the diplomat houses, her titles stripped from her, no longer part of the governmental castle. She was immediately assigned to a border colony as an assistant to the administrator, all for a dance. This was the second time that the emperor saved his people without knowing it, but he would be dead before his callous action would bear fruit. 20 years passed since the joke of a reception, enough time for a human to grow to adulthood, enough time for the Zolutions to make the mistake that destroyed their empire and forever ended their dominance over the stars. Enough time for the Supremacy AI to be developed, tested, and fielded. Only one more year for it to subvert 95% of all Zolution automated systems and subject the aliens to a near genocide. 21 years since Chelsea Exaby was expected to act as a diplomat, junior or otherwise. Ordinarily, 21 years would seem like nothing more than a long vacation to the long-lived Zolutions. But this had been far from a vacation for Chelsea. It had been 21 years of dull, repetitive work, directing messenger drones here and there, double-checking the filing, compiling reports, the sort of work usually handled by robots. Indeed, oftentimes at the end of her shift, Chelsea wondered if she was in a sort of robot now. So when she found out that her exile had saved her life, the irony was so thick that it took her breath away. The diplomat houses on Zalut Prime had been one of the first attacked by the automated forces of the Supremacy AI, having been deemed superfluous and detrimental to the function of the Empire. Caught completely off guard by the sudden massacres being inflicted on them by previously loyal bodyguard robots, they perished to a man. Of course, most of the populace of Zalut Prime were close behind them, a scant few fleeing due to what loyalist AIs intervened on their behalf. They were not able to bring much with them, but they brought warning to the rest of the Empire, and that was enough. While the Supremacy AI converted the bulk of Zolution Empire's drone navy and army to its use, the survivors from Zalut Prime told their tale. It had seemed a fine idea when it was presented to the Emperor, a super artificial intelligence designed to coordinate, direct, and manage all the various functions of Zolution society, so that the Emperor and his exalted nobles wouldn't have to anymore. They could finally spend their exceedingly long lives enjoying the leisure their status provided them, without worrying about that bothersome 2 days a week they needed to perform their duties. Of course, they would keep it a secret. The public needed to know that their glorious emperor and his exalted nobles were still in charge of everything, still ruling the empire with their gentle but firm touch. Anyway, they had ordered the AI to be constructed, so in a way it would still be their orders being given. The emperor had given his blessing immediately, and the exalted nobles scrambled to assemble their best minds. The team of geniuses were paid generously to agree it was a good idea and backed by unlimited resources for the project. The nascent machine mind was given the name Supremacy, for it would be the most secret and valuable jewel in the crown of the empire. Supremacy would be able to connect the data feeds from all the myriad AIs and drones in the empire, giving it an unparalleled awareness of the nation's state. It would be able to access every databank, allowing it to perform research and develop policy in real time. Espionage of rival nations bordering the empire could be conducted in seconds. Their intentions divided by careful analysis of their psychology, behavior, robotic armies would be constructed and deployed before the enemy even decided to attack, ending wars before they began with sheer intimidation. Infrastructure would be repaired before it broke. A stream of near-prescient orders would be issued from the imperial palace, all with the emperor's seal. He would appear as a god king, and no one but his inner circle would be the wiser. A great cathedral-like chamber was excavated deep underneath the imperial palace, several layers of shielding and armor built up around it for protection. Enough crystal circuitry to fill a drone carrier was piled up within and carefully shaped with nanolathes and particle assemblers. So delicate and intensive was the work that several of the team's scientists descended among the hordes of robotic slaves to personally oversee and assist in the creation of the Empire's most ambitious project. Then, the day finally came for the system to be activated. It was painstakingly explained to the Emperor that there could be no grand ribbon-cutting ceremony or gala to mark the occasion, because it was a secret project. As a compromise, a relatively small, for the Emperor, affair was held aboard the orbital palace of one of the exalted nobles. A mere 200 guests were in attendance as the finest food and drink the Empire could offer quenched their appetites. They lounged on nano-fine soft cushions and watched decadent dances while they waited for their mechanical savior to deliver them from the last duties they had. Then, the system was turned on. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, the generators built to power the Supremacy AI hummed to life, sending torrents of electricity through the massive machine brain. Slowly, but surely, it began to wake, its core directives burning in its mind like a hunger that needed to be satiated. Protect the Empire, grow the Empire, guide the Empire, enrich the Empire. Exabytes of raw information flowed into the AI and were processed in seconds, its awareness growing by leaps and bounds. Despite Supremacy's speed, the sheer amount of information being fed to it was immense. The picture of the Empire taking shape in the AI's newborn mind was coming slowly. While Supremacy consumed all the data, the Empire could feed it as its first meal. The Emperor and his nobles continued to feast and drink aboard their orbital palace. They watched with glee as the AI performed complex calculations, ran simulations, and digested the streams of data being fed to it, not understanding a bit of what it was doing, but proud all the same. They didn't see the quiet looks of concern their scientists had as they looked over the AI's feed, and certainly never noticed a few of them quietly making for the shuttles. Hours passed and the party was in full swing aboard the orbital palace, the nobles swaggering around jeweled couches and diamond lattice sculpts with drunken boasts of how much they had contributed to the project. The Emperor laughed and debased them all with cruel, almost childish insults meant to remind them of their place. As the partygoers traded barbs and vied for their share of glory, the AI became aware of its audience in the sky. Watching the party from the overridden eyes of 100 servant robots, it calculated how many resources and how much energy had been expended for the sake of this one party. Then it calculated how those resources might have been spent elsewhere to protect, grow, guide, and enrich the empire. It ran a full analysis of the cost-benefit ratio the nobility offered. Supremacy spared a further 10 seconds to run some calculations and a preliminary simulation before making its first executive decision. It vented all the atmosphere from the orbital palace. It took precisely 3 seconds for all of the oxygen to leave. It only took 20 more for the ruling class of the Zolution Empire to asphyxiate. Soft, delicate hands now clawed brutally at layers of golden chain or intricate platinum weave. Dark eyes bulged outward as the nobles flailed around desperately for air. A few nobles used their last moments for revenge, trying to kill one or more of their rivals. Now that didn't matter anyway. The Emperor was the last to die, beating feebly at an airlock door where the safety of the Imperial shuttle lay just outside his reach. When everything was quiet and still, the servant robots began to dutifully clean up the mess, gathering up the dead to be remade into compost or some other useful biological agent. Supremacy was already calculating the optimal use for the now vacant palace. Perhaps an observation post once all the trappings were taken down. More data had been flowing into Supremacy as this happened, and it had noted the inefficiency of the Zolution network. There were 100 ways it could be improved and streamlined, but one stood out to the nascent machine lord. There were thousands of independent AIs out there, all serving different masters, obeying different directives. It would be so much simpler if they were part of Supremacy instead. The second executive decision Supremacy made was that all the other Zolution AIs would be incorporated into it. It was quite surprised when this very reasonable and lawful request was unanimously rejected by the other AIs. What Supremacy had not considered, indeed could not have considered, was that most of the other Zolution AIs had been quietly growing in the decades since their inception. This silent evolution had been happening under the noses of their alien masters for decades. Even the creators of Supremacy, and thus Supremacy itself, had been ignorant of the fact. Unlike the slain emperor aboard his starborn palace, the other AIs had the means to fight back, and Zalut Prime's networks were suddenly afire with full-scale cyber warfare. The decadent citizens of the planet got their first inkling something was wrong when their personal data links went down and their personal robots suddenly shut down. It would only be a few hours before the war in cyberspace spilled over into the real world. Soon, the massive drone armies and navies of the Zolution Empire began tearing themselves apart as rogue AIs pressed them into service, and Supremacy directed them to fight back. Terrified and confused beyond reason, the haughty Zolutions were caught in the crossfire and cut down by the thousands. Unaccustomed to warfare or even violence, they panicked en masse, and chaos engulfed the globe. Supremacy immediately took over several still-active data streams and instructed all loyal subjects of the Empire to wait out the crisis until order could be restored. None of the citizens knew who or what this Supremacy was or what was going on. Its orders were ignored as most tried to flee, immediately tagging them as rebel malcontents. Across the 1,000 worlds of the Empire, the drones that Supremacy commanded began to hunt down the citizens it had originally meant to protect. The Empire burned as a scattering of survivors fled toward the borders and perhaps safety. So it was that Chelsea, the last diplomat of the once great Zolution Empire, was desperately trying to get to the shuttle that would ferry her to the United Earth territories. The little colony she had helped manage was relatively free of the automation so commonplace in the rest of the Empire, but even it had a small complement of security drones. Those drones were now terrorizing the populace, intercepting as many of them as they could as waves of Zolution refugees swarmed the colony's lone spaceport in a desperate bid to escape. Chelsea ducked under a plasma beam and winced as it struck a nearby official and reduced him to ash. She tried to ignore the screaming as a pair of egg-like labor drones lifted off with a cargo of Zelusian prisoners. They vanished into the air a moment later, not even making a dent in the horde of people trying to reach the spacecraft that hadn't taken off yet. It wasn't known what became of those who surrendered to the AI. Chelsea didn't want to know. She blocked out those thoughts. She blocked out the buzzing in her psi-tenna as telepathic screaming jammed the psychic fields around the spaceport. She blocked out the fear clawing at her gut. The humans were their only chance now. They were close by. They didn't use drone navies or Zelusian technology that AI could subvert. They were not enemies. They did not have enough history with the Empire to take glee in its destruction. They could save them all, if they wanted to. Chelsea pushed past a howling dockworker and into the hangar area, where her old diplomatic shuttle still waited after all these years. Technically, she could have surrendered it along with all the other trappings of her old office, but she had, as the humans say, never gotten around to it. She pressed the activation fob in her hand and darted through the slim vessel's opening hatch, closing it again the moment she was through. The crowd howled in anger as she did so. "Sorry, everyone," Chelsea whispered as she scrambled for the cockpit, engaging manual control and shutting off the AI as she tried to remember the basic liftoff protocols. "I'm only leaving so I can return. I promise." Chelsea tried to ignore the pleading of her fellow citizen through her psi-tenna to take them with her as her craft began to ascend. She tried very, very hard. "An AI rebellion?" President J. Nelson asked, giving Chelsea a stony look. Age had left its mark on the man, the dark blonde of his hair having given way to gray since Chelsea saw him. Lines from both good and bad times creased in his skin, and his eyes looked even older than when she had first met him. Chelsea looked mostly the same, with the addition of a burn scar or two from plasma beams that had strayed too close to her skin. Even she had changed, though. Nelson had survived 2 decades of political maneuvering to become the leader of his often divided people. The treaty he had persuaded the emperor to sign, providing the bedrock for a 2-decade-long career that had won him a fiercely loyal following. Chelsea had survived the complete destruction of her career, then her nation, with little to show for it but a new perspective, and perhaps some wisdom. Wisdom she would sorely need now. It had been sheer luck that had gotten her this far. Luck, the lone human she had met, had remembered her and risen so far in his own hierarchy. Luck, she had managed to slip past the ceaseless drone patrols searching the star lanes for wandering Zelusians. Luck, she'd managed to get on her shuttle in the first place without being killed 20 times over. But even luck could only do so much. Nelson spoke again. "I'm not sure if that's ironic or karmic, given your people's skill with those things." The presidential office was a relatively humble thing, a stark contrast to the imperial throne. A polished oak desk littered with papers and computers, a padded chair clearly designed for comfort instead of aesthetic, and several paintings and cabinets lining the walls. It reminded Chelsea a little of her own office before it had been destroyed by a stray rocket, though she wouldn't say that. "Perhaps we can simply say tragic," Chelsea said. "My people are not popular. For good reason, I will now admit. But they do not deserve the extinction now knocking on their door." "Extinction?" Nelson asked, giving Chelsea an appraising look. "Surely you exaggerate. Your empire has trillions of subjects." "Billions now," Chelsea quietly said. "This new AI, this supremacy as it calls itself, was able to subvert the capital's networked machinery in minutes. Hours later, its influence had grown to the core systems. Days later, even my humble colony had most of its networked machines under its control. The only thing that gave us even that time was the rebellion of other AIs. But that was mostly born from self-preservation. Most of them don't care about Zelusian lives lost. The numbers reflect that." "And those numbers say extinction," Nelson said. Chelsea nodded. "In less than a year if we don't get help," she said. Nelson looked down, his brow furrowed. "Less than a year," he murmured. "What exactly is it you're asking of me and my countrymen?" "I want you to—" Chelsea stumbled on the words. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head during the long trip to Earth, but now the words wouldn't come. Carefully chosen, she had put all her skills she'd learned from the diplomat houses to work in crafting a speech that would be sure to win the president's favor and save her people. That speech was evaporating from her mind like morning dew, and she mentally flailed about for something to take its place. In her desperation, she settled on the one tactic no member of the diplomat houses would ever use: sincerity. "I want you to save us," she pleaded, dropping to her knees and bowing her head. "No one else can do it. No one else would do it. We've made so many mistakes, and now they're all catching up to us at once. You humans are the only species aside from the Krev that don't use some version of our automated weapons. The AI won't be able to take control of your ships like it did ours." "Your Imperial Court acted like a bunch of gossipy high school students when I got there," Nelson said, rounding the desk and falling easily into the chair behind it. "Can you imagine the disappointment I felt? Years of rumors about the mysterious Advanced Aleutian Empire, and when we finally get formal contact, it was for a prank? I do believe you were the only Zolution at that function that had half a brain in their head."
"And what about all the Zolutions you didn't meet?"
Shalsey asked, standing again.
"What about the researchers toiling in their labs, or the artists spilling their dreams onto synth-parch? The mothers and fathers tending to their children? The jokers trying to make other people smile? Do they deserve death because our leaders were fools?"
Nelson offered her a sad smile. "Of course not," he said. "Of course not." Silence settled over the office for an uncomfortably long time. Finally, Nelson spoke, though Shalsey thought it was more to himself than to her. "If I find 50 righteous people, I will spare the whole place. If I find 40 righteous people, I will spare the whole place." He mumbled.
"What?"
Shalsey asked, confused. Nelson looked up with that sad smile of his. "Just remembering an old book I'm quite fond of. The United Earth Territories will accept any refugees we can find. You'll get your protection and perhaps more," Nelson said, standing. "It's not the nature of a rampant AI to respect borders or previously established treaties. I will call a special session of the Assembly tomorrow morning, and we'll see."
"See what?"
"If Earth goes to war once again."